Last week I did a colloquy at San Francisco Zen Center online with Norman Fisher, transmitted priest who runs an organization called Everyday Zen, and Fu Schrader, who was the abbot of Green Gulch. And I introduced this subject called Vernacular Buddhism. The vernacular is the common language of everyday people spoken in the time and place. And I began thinking about this because for almost 50 years, 49 years, I've been studying Zen. And Zen is a Japanese word, and the way it's been presented to Americans is through Japanese forms. And Zen itself has had various traditions, various schools. Some are faith-based, and they just chant the name of Buddha over and over again. Everyone's heard about Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, another faith-based practice. But Zen is not a faith-based practice. And so the way Zen came into being was that there was a man named Dogen in the 12th century in Japan, a formidable student, and Buddhism had come to Japan about 6 centuries earlier, and it had established itself and become more and more ornate and more centered on delivering groovy rituals to the everyday people and celebrating the grandeur of Buddha with grand temples. Dogen was unsatisfied with this quality of teaching, and he and his teacher went to China in the 12th century. It was quite an arduous trip. And they went and they traveled around China trying on different teachers. And they found a teacher teaching in a tradition called Chan. Chan is the Chinese equivalent of Zen. And this was a very simple, very stripped down, unintellectual, not a lot of studying, not a lot of reading, a lot of concentrating on sitting, and kensho, which is the Japanese word for awakening, or satori, which is comes from a Japanese root of understanding, which is deep kensho, sort of permanent alteration. And they stayed with this man for a long time. They studied for quite a while, and then Dogen's teacher died, and he came back to Japan bringing this practice with him, this Zen practice. And he was the founder of the Soto school, which is the kind of biggest school in Japan today. And the other school was Rinzai school, and Rinzai tended to be more the expression of the aristocrats, very austere, very formal. Their children were samurai warriors trained to work with sharp blades, and they had to have their wits about them to do that. Soto was more available to everyone, women, men, common people. And whereas Rinzai focused very firmly on pushing people to kensho so they could go back to being nobles, Soto's guiding metaphor was more like walking in the fog till your clothes get soaked. If you just do this, wisdom will dampen you. So when Dogen died, there was a lot of fuss about who was going to take over. And in the next couple of centuries, the emphasis on kensho kind of disappeared. And Buddhism became more interested in ceremonies, which they could do for common people. Weddings, funerals, memorials, blessings, things like that, which people really loved and needed. It was a way they made a livelihood and paid for the temple, as well as by begging. And then, after a while, people began to think about kensho again. There's a man named Keizan who wrote a book called Transmission of the Light, which was all about satori, all about the history of every disciple of Buddha. And this again reignited an interest in Zen in Japan and the stripped down original core understanding of Zen. So there were kind of two schools. One, let's call it the classic school, which San Francisco Zen Center represents, which my training was involved in. Although I didn't live monastically. I was a lay student, but they're a repository of ceremonies and practices and group communal monastic living. And the other lineage in Japan was people who didn't pay too much attention to lineage. Some teachers never admitted who their teachers were until they were dying because their wisdom was self-evident. They didn't depend on a lineage. They didn't depend on somebody saying, okay, you got it, you go ahead. So I was interested in both. And after a while at Zen Center, I started to get a little restive with what I used to tease my friends and call Japanesmo. All the Japanese words we had for each other. I still don't know all the roles. The doan, the doshi, the jiki-jitsu, the anja, the this one, the that one. And I began to get the feeling that there was more attention being put on the impeccable reproduction of Japanese ceremonies than there was in being kind and helping people. In fact, people at Zen Center will admit that it's kind of a chilly place. You can knock on the door and somebody comes to answer it like an oil painting and says, "Can I help you?" So I went for 5 years. My first teacher was a poet named Gary Snyder, just a guy that I admired and who'd lived in Japan for 9 years in a Zen temple, married a Japanese wife, read and spoke Japanese. I figured if anybody knew what Zen was about, it was going to be him. And this was long before I sat. But after a while, he began to sit. He wanted to finish some koan studies that he didn't finish in Japan. And he began to work with Robert Aitken. And so I did too for 5 years. And I was kind of a dismal koan student. I didn't take to it too well. I wasn't very good at it. They give you this riddle to crack, and you work on this relentlessly day and night. And in sessions where you're sitting every day, you wait outside to have a conference with your teacher, and he rings a little bell from his hut, and you go running in and do prostrations, and then you're supposed to present your understanding to him. So sometimes you go in and you have nothing to say. You feel like a real doofus. Or sometimes, like myself, you go in thinking, I cracked this puppy. And you sit down and you say, I got Moo, I've seen it. And he says, oh yeah? How old is Moo? And it must feel like standing in front of a freight train on the railroad tracks because you've just been obliterated. But it did feel to me, whereas Suzuki Roshi's lineage talked about just sitting, shikantaza, just sitting. You don't need to set goals because your personality is setting those goals. You just want to sink below your personality. In this Sambo Kyodan lineage of Aitken Roshis, which was a mix of Rinzai and Soto, felt like everybody was trying too hard, that Kensho was reified into this sacred object, and we had to get it, and some people would get it, there'd be lots of cheers, and the people who didn't felt like doofuses. So at a certain point, about 5 years, I came back and I met my teacher, Lou Richmond, who was a lay practitioner. Ordained disciple of Suzuki Roshi, been at Zen Center for a long time, senior priest and student there. And he said something to me one day which just caught my ear. He said, if you're not kind to people, if you're not helpful to people, who cares what your spiritual experience is? You come to me and you say, Buddha just gave me a dozen roses, or I've been enlightened, I've had Kensho. What's your behavior like? So I began to follow this mode of thinking, and I ran across this quote from Suzuki Roshi, where he says, to attain enlightenment is maybe not so difficult. to attain enlightenment is not so difficult. Basically, he says, if you practice well, it'll come. You don't have to worry about it. What is difficult is to renew that enlightenment moment after moment. In other words, to build character, enlightened activity, or behavior. So enlightenment is a verb. It's not a territory. It's not a fence that you hurdle and you're on the other side and all of a sudden you understand everything and you have no more karma, you have no more difficulties. Enlightenment is an action. It's a verb. And sometimes it's informed by Kensho or Satori. Sometimes it's not. But if you follow the Eightfold Path, Buddha's prescription for an enlightened life, and if you follow the precepts, Suzuki Roshi assures you that it's almost as good. And the only reason he says almost is because there's a moment before Kensho and there's a moment afterwards. You've always been the same person. It's just afterwards you know it. Before it you didn't. So I became very interested in, okay, how do we foster and how do we help people with this kind of enlightened life, the Eightfold Path, following the precepts? And one of the things that concerned me was that Zen always felt kind of foreign. You go in this place, well, even me, I wear these Japanese clothes when I teach. They're really comfortable. They're really easy. It's kind of a Zen tuxedo, but it's Japanese. And I wanted to kind of loosen the gift wrapping. So in every country that Buddhism inhabited, it changed its expression, its formal expression, to be consonant with the customs and the habits of the people there, so it wouldn't feel strange. It grew out of a Hindu culture in India, and that's where a lot of the concentration on reincarnation and stuff came from. But Buddha would not accept the caste system. He ordained women, he ordained men of all castes. Anybody could practice. Bodhidharma brought it to China, and in China it mixed with Confucianism and mixed with Taoism and became something else again. Then it came to Korea. From Korea it came to Japan, and it mixed with Shinto, nativist kind of wildness religion of Japan. In Tibet, it mixed with Bon shamanism and developed the Vajrayana with a lot of magical stuff and incantations which were designed to help people speed toward enlightenment. But in America, we tended to practice the way our teachers taught us. So when I was studying with Aitken Roshi, I came across this quote. And this quote is actually in my new book, but this was sort of a turning word for me. This is by a man named Yamada Muman Roshi. He's in the tradition of Aitken Roshi. He said, I expect original words from you. I expect original words from you. But we have to be careful at this point. This word must be expressed by a person who comes to the same mind as Shakyamuni Buddha. Then the original American way can be naturally realized. So I came to Zen partially because of this notion of transmission and certification. I didn't want to be Bubba Free John. I didn't want to be the guy that started the farm like some self-ordained prophet. I wanted to mature in a tradition where people had been studying and certifying enlightenment and wisdom and various practices for a long time. But when Suzuki Roshi came to this country, he had virtually no ceremonies. And I just found this out a little while ago. He just taught people to sit zazen. You bowed to your pillow, you turned around, you bowed to the other people who were sitting with you, and then you sat. And at the end of sitting, you'd recite the Heart Sutra 3 times. And the Americans recited it ponderously slowly, agonizing, according to friends of mine who were there. But he never corrected anyone. He never said a thing, because Suzuki Roshi had great trust in the inventiveness and the intention of Americans. He left Japan because he felt that Buddhism had become moribund, had become institutional, had lost the spark of Zen, and he bloody well loved the Americans. And for a number of years, Zen Center was run like a very communal, cooperative, inventive, improvisational unit. Then when Suzuki Roshi was dying, he transmitted an abbot named Richard Baker, very talented, very brilliant man, who'd been living in Japan, and he really came out of the beat tradition originally. And when he came back from Japan to help Suzuki Roshi, he had long hair and a beard, and he insisted he was not going to run Zen Center as a priest. And Suzuki Roshi argued with him, and he still said, no, I'm not going to do it. So Suzuki Roshi said, fine, because he trusted that Richard Baker would actually build the institutions of Tassajara and Green Gulch and Zen Center. Well, once he assumed authority, he realized that it might be a little more difficult getting money for a hippie Zen Center than a really formal, elegant, Japanismo kind of institution. So he cut his hair and he shaved his beard, and he got the most beautiful robes known to man. And he asked a fellow named Tatsugami, who came from the most formal training monastery in Japan called Eiheiji, invited him to come to Zen Center. And basically, Tatsugami, I won't say imposed, but brought the entire curriculum of Eiheiji with him. And it was kind of a sea change in Zen Center. At that point, it became very formal, very Japanese. There was a authority, Tatsugami, who knew this stuff. And gradually, just before he died, Suzuki Roshi disinvited Tatsugami because he had a very different idea of practice, but he died. And so in this colloquy the other night, we were discussing the differences between this classical form of teaching and the more improvisatory form. And I say improvisatory because for about 40 years, I've been traveling the country to various Zen centers, teaching improvisation and acting exercises in the morning as a prelude to putting a mask on people and holding a mirror in front of them. And after a morning's being softened up, when you see yourself in a mask in a mirror, your personality vacates and the personality of the mask takes over. I've never had it not happen in 45 years of teaching. And with the absence of your original personality goes your self-consciousness, your second-guessing, your double-thinking, your insecurities. And people get a little temporary 10-minute experience of real liberation. And it's fun, and it has very good practical benefits. I use it teaching voiceovers sometime, and people will read a text in the voice of one of their masked characters, and it'll be a 200% improvement over their own. And then when they read it in their own afterwards, they keep all the changes. And so I use that as a lost leader for Buddhism, saying, if you like that sense of freedom, you need to meditate, you need to understand Buddha's description of reality, and you need to practice, and you can make those states available to you on recall or as memory. So we had this really interesting conversation where my friends were saying, yeah, we don't yet have the classical San Francisco Zen Center that we want. We are a little chilly. She told a story of bringing a black friend down to Tassajara, which is a very traditional monastery down in Big Sur. And the woman was there for a few days and said, I can't practice here. And everybody says, why? And she said, well, nobody smiles. Nobody says hello. Nobody greets me when I come in the room. And it's sort of a cultural thing. People are trying to leave space for other people to be themselves. But as I said that evening, do it after you say hello. So I've been working on a definition of Vernacular Buddhism. And I'm not suggesting that I've solved the problem of resolving the formal or the classical and the improvisatory. But I'm beaming in on the focus, and I'm trusting my friends and relations from the classical tradition to help me, and I'm trusting my friends who are out in the wilder edges of Zen to help me. But this is kind of the way it's breaking down. Another way of expressing vernacular Buddhism might be to say it's the practice of developing character in a culturally authentic and long-lasting way, so that whatever you do or wherever you are, you can express it. So this is quite different than thinking of Kensho or enlightenment as some kind of attractive, radical goal that you've just got to get hold of. This is like saying, it's my job to take care of myself. It's my job to lighten up my dark spots, my unruly emotions, my passions, my things that are driving me off an even keel, and to develop character. And character is the verb of enlightenment. The way you behave, moment after moment, renewing your insight, renewing your faith in Buddha nature, which is the only thing that we ask you to take on faith, is that there's a pregnant energy behind the visible world, which is continually expressing itself as the visible world. Emptiness and form. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, so the sutra goes. So the only way we can regard or perceive emptiness is when it assumes form. But if you try to take or deconstruct a form, there's nothing there. There's no little homunculus behind my forehead, little PD coyote up here doing my seeing, hearing, thinking, tasting, perceiving. If you think of yourself as an empty tube, the tube is filled with awareness. And we then take and we construct a personality around that awareness, and then we forget that the awareness preceded the personality. And we think the personality is all there is. And then we're in prison. Then we're stuck in a world of contradictions. We're stuck in a world of and/ors, if, but. But the remedy, the technology for resolving that is sitting zazen. Sitting every day. Having a consistent practice, day in and day out, and extending that zazen mind farther and farther into your days. And when you forget, you remind yourself and come back to it. Just like in zazen, when you forget your breathing, you correct yourself. When your posture slumps, you correct yourself. So it's quite a different understanding. So what I'm doing in these Dharma talks and this book I'm trying to write and in my own character development is find a way to talk about Buddhism to people who are never going to shave their heads, who are never going to wear robes. You know, I work out here with Mexican gardeners and truck drivers and farmers and, restaurateurs and busboys and waiters. I want to help those people. And my instinct is, as long as Zen appears foreign, it will be mystified, it will be tolerated, some people will be curious about it, but the tendency is always to confuse the exoticism with the wisdom. You know, you look at the Tibetans and the Vajrayana ceremonies, drinking out of a top of a human skull, and these great monsters dancing in huge masks and 7-foot long horns. It's wiggy. It's wiggy. But the germinating seed of all that is absolutely the same as the germinating seed of Buddha's teaching. All of these, I don't want to use the word cult, it has a negative sound, but like, you know, Protestants don't think less of Episcopalians or Methodists or Lutherans or Calvinists or Baptists, hopefully. They're all expressing differences of emphasis on the teachings of Christ. And all the schools of Buddhism are just expressing different emphasis on some aspect of the Buddhist teaching. So I'm drawn to Zen because it's the least doctrinaire. It's the most founded on insight. But the problem with insight is that over time, people begin to think of it as a goal and not as a beginning. Traditionally, Kensho is a beginning of deepening your practice. Not that you can't practice without it, but when you have this perception of nobody home and the world is still operating, it's okay. That's the first step that induces you to really look at and revise all of your habits and your assumptions and your beliefs, because you've just gotten a new information source. You know, you've gotten a big download from the universe. And now you have to say, oh, I see. Wait a minute. I'm made of the same thing as Donald Trump. That's a wake up. That's uncomfortable to live with, but it's a fact. So somehow you have to deal with it. Anyway, I'm going to return again and again to this idea of vernacular Zen. I can see this is becoming my mode of expression and my mode of exploration. I don't want to abandon what I learned from my teachers. I did memorial ceremony for someone today. I chant. Some of the chants are in not even Japanese. They're in Japanese alliterations of Pali or Sanskrit. The Japanese don't even know what they mean. But I don't know what the Kaddish means in Judaism. But when I chant it in memory of somebody, it's very moving. And so I'm chanting these seed syllables of sound because I received them. They certainly don't do any harm, and it gives me the opportunity to do formal expressions of appreciation. Today's the anniversary of Pete Seeger's death, for instance. Also the death of my cousin who founded the Holocaust Oral History Project and did 3,800 video interviews with survivors of Auschwitz. And I introduced her to Steven Spielberg, and he hired her to train all his interviewers for his Shoah project. She died at 50. So some of these things are just inheritances. Some of them are cultural. Buddhism's maybe been in America 100 years. That's nothing. But I want to do my part without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I want to do my part to integrate it so that Americans can recognize these states of Kensho and Satori are human states. They're not owned by the Japanese. They're not owned by the Hindus. They're not owned by Buddha. These are human states. And to the extent that we can explain them and express them in American, we extend our possibility of helping others. So I think that's about enough. I thank you all for listening. Remember, you can write to me if you have questions at sfzencoyote@gmail.com. I'm slow, but I do try to answer. So I'm going to say the metta prayer. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace.